But before I bring him into discussion, there's a few things I want to cover off first, beginning with the technical differences in the playback environment for this format and how it relates to others. I realize this has been covered in previous technical sessions, so I won't go in as depth, but I think it's a good starting point, and this will be considered foreshadowing for my audio demos that are coming up later. Next slide, please. This is stereo. Pretty straightforward. A lot of broadcasters still air stereo full mixes. These mixes have the dynamic range measured with Dolby loudness specs, which is limited to a set range. Next slide. This is TV 5.1. Most broadcasters will only allow voice in the center channel. Music and effects must be kept out of the center, and the dynamic range is again measured with Dolby loudness and limited to a set range. Next slide, please. This is feature 5.1. 5 full range speakers. 0.1 is the limited range speaker for the sub. Dynamics is not limited to a set range, but projectionists would really appreciate you not hitting the speakers so hard that they overload or shut down, or worse, blow up. But rattling a few ceiling tiles is okay. We respectfully limit the peaks to just under the overload measurement. Next slide. This is Dolby Atmos. The speaker configuration ranges from 16 to, well, however many satisfy the ratio calculation. Dolby Atmos is a sound field based on the size of the theater. This ensures soundtracks translate no matter the size of the dubbing stage for the mix was done in to the size of the theater the audience will watch the film. Next slide, please. This is IMAX 12. Sorry, I don't have a better image. There are 12 speakers in fixed location. Next slide. 4 screen speakers, left, center, right, and center top. There's 2 speakers on each side wall, left side, right side. 2 speakers in the rear of the theater, rear left, rear right. And 4 ceiling speakers, front, left and right ceiling, and rear left and right ceiling. There is no discrete LFE track in this format. The LFE is derived from all speakers in the system. Now, I know I went through that pretty quickly, so after the session, if you have more questions about the specifics, let me know. As I said, this is a basic overview of the most common soundtrack formats used in various types of productions. And what I want to discuss with you is how these formats are used, in a broad sense, creatively, and hopefully give some insight into what makes large format sound design different. Next slide. I want to start by asking the question, what is sound design? I know we have a variety of filmmakers, students, and others associated with the industry here today. And as I talk to a variety of people about their soundtrack, I hear a variety of thoughts of what sound design is. So I thought I would quote one of the most successful sound designers out there, Randy Thom. For those who don't recognize the names, his credits include Ice Age, The Incredibles, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Castaway, just to name a very few. Next slide. Here is his thoughts on what sound design is. A well-orchestrated and recorded piece of musical score has minimal value if it hasn't been integrated into the film as a whole. Giving the actors plenty of things to say in every scene isn't necessarily doing them, their characters, or the movie a favor. Sound, musical and otherwise, has value when it is part of a continuum, when it changes over time, has dynamics, and resonates with other sound and with other sensory experiences. This, in my opinion, is what sound design is. How all elements in the soundtrack work together to give the audience a strong sensory experience. It's not necessarily how loud the explosion is, or if a thunder crack makes you jump out of your seat, or if you recognize the song and can tap your foot to the beat. It's the full experience over the length of the film. It's the quiet scenes and all the subtleties and textures that you can hear in the quiet. It's the build of the score to a crescendo and how it works with the image in a unique way, and with that, how it makes you feel. This is sound design, a continuum that changes over time, has dynamics, and resonates other sound with other sensory experiences. Now, for the sake of this discussion, I wanted to focus on documentary films, as I feel scripted films live in their own category. Also, documentary films is the categories I mostly sound design for in large format. In the feature doc world, the approach to sound design seems to be authentic yet minimal. We don't want to add too much or do too much, for example, panning, bringing the sound design off the screen into the theater, so not to distract from the story being told on the screen. My experience is that the main energy of the soundtrack comes from the music and the authenticity of the sounds used. Say that 5 times real fast. For TV docs, the focus on sound design seems to be even less. The format with tight broadcaster specs doesn't allow for, and some say doesn't warrant, a lot of extra sound textures or definition. Musically is usually what carries a soundtrack, with sparsely added spot effects to fill holes and punctuate story points. As broadcasters get away from stereo delivery of docs and move to 5.1, the opportunity to expand on soundtracks is limited due to their specs, which won't allow certain elements in the center channel, how much can be placed in the rear speakers, or the limits on the LFE channel. Now, I'll qualify these comments don't describe all broadcasters, and streaming services such as Netflix and others are using Dolby Atmos home theater as a delivery requirement, which does allow for much fuller soundtrack. This describes, however, my experience in delivering documentary films in other formats, and now I want to talk about the large format soundtrack. In large format, the format is meant to be immersive. The size and clarity of the image and the addition of 3D are meant to fully engulf the audience in the story they're watching, to be almost a participant or at least a present witness. And I'm happy to say that the soundtrack is a key component of this. I would say it's 60% of the experience, as would Steven Spielberg, but I'm a little biased. The way we approach this and how we accomplish this can be mostly broken down into 3 points. Next slide, please. The use of layers, textures, and definition. Next slide. Hopefully you can make sense of this graphic. I define layers as the part of the soundtrack that will fill the theater from top to bottom, front to back, and from side to side. And each of these 3 dimensions are meant to be unique. The sound used, which I call the bass sound, can be similar, but it's not meant to be identical. It's this uniqueness of each of the layers that gives the audience that all-important perception that they are immersed in the film. There's an organic movement and space to the base layer that really brings the audience there. Next slide, please. Next, let me talk about textures. Textures are used in 2 different ways. As an addition to the immersive layers, where they're not necessarily supporting the images on the screen directly, they appear in different speakers of the sound field surrounding the audience. This brings the layers to life, taking the audience on location. Specific bird calls, different insect sounds, some chirping, some grinding, authentic sounds of a time in history, or sounds of the city and their dialects. The second use of textures is to directly support the images on the screen. For example, the sound of a raging forest fires in all its voices, flies buzzing around the lower left side of the screen, helicopters flying overhead. By adding textures both in the theater and on the screen, we create a strong immersive sonic experience for the audience. And the last point is definition, which I would also define as localization, where sounds appear to originate from and where they move to. And sometimes it's nowhere because they're static. I believe to create a real immersive experience, you need to orient the audience to where they are in the scene, which we do by accurately localizing sounds to the images on the screen and moving those sounds through the sound field as warranted. It's also done with off-screen textures as well, as I mentioned earlier. Those sounds aren't specific to images on the screen. Localization of off-screen textures, some moving, some not, create a very dynamic soundtrack. The next thing I want to touch on is dynamics and working in large format calibrated dubbing stages. IMAX 12.0 is a very powerful system, and the derived sub requires some attention. Soundtracks for this format need to be mixed in a properly calibrated 12.0 dubbing stage and or a properly calibrated 6.0 dubbing stage. You need to understand the effects of the derived sub on your music, effects, and voice. With 5.1, the results are a little bit more familiar and controlled because of the popularity of those types of mixes and dubbing stages. 12.0 and 6.0 are unique, and without the use of a calibrated dubbing stage for these formats, you can find that the levels are different from what you thought, leading to increased bottom end and or booming voice tracks or EQ shifts in certain elements. So now I think we'll shift the conversation to music and bring Sam into the conversation. Come on up, Sam. We're gonna have to huddle around this one microphone here. Thank you for being so patient. So the first thing I want to talk about, and I guess ask, as a composer who's worked in multiple formats, how does your approach to large format score differ from maybe a TV score or a feature doc score?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I will never, ever again complain about 12.0. That was amazing. That is just an absolute miracle, and it is so immersive, as you say. Of course, the biggest difference is just scale, and you have opportunities with this format that doesn't exist any other way because you can't possibly communicate this kind of scale in any other of the visual mediums. And I love, when I was just a kid, I would go seek out an IMAX theater in Las Vegas. It was actually Omnispheres. Anybody remember that? The filmmakers hated it because it distorted the images, right? But I lived in Salt Lake City, and I would go drive there just so I could have this experience. But scale is the biggest difference, and that shows up in all kinds of ways in terms of orchestrating the music and just making sure that you can feel the epic component.
Great. And that sort of leads into my next question for, like, would you say that your arrangements are different when you get into large format scoring as opposed to like television scoring, or and what way would that be different?
Well, I still am a huge fan of living, breathing human beings, and I think having real musicians in IMAX is absolutely paramount. And so even when I get crappy budgets, I can't resist the temptation to use actual musicians. There's something about the imperfection that comes from musicians. There's something about a little bit of chaos. There's something about the synergy that comes from 80 or 90 people all contributing to a whole that makes a huge difference in large format. And that being said, the intimate is really powerful. A solo violin and a solo voice is a beautiful thing in this format when contrasted with something that's epic.
And I guess that would sort of lead to say that those sort of things aren't necessarily, they don't come across in the other. This is one of the only formats where what you just described would actually come across in the track. Yeah.
For sure. One of the things I've always loved about large format, there's not a lot of acting to get in the way, and so this visual and oral feast is a fantastic opportunity for music, and it's one of my favorite things about large format, and I've always loved scores from IMAX films because they can say more. I think they can do more.
Great. So now shifting to some more, you've written the score, you've used live, you want to use live musicians. So do you tend to push your engineers to track in a multi-format, or sorry, a multi-channel environment? And do you go as far as to say, here's the layout of an IMAX 12 theater audience, this is the way the audience is going to hear it. Can we mimic this? Can we, use place mics and get a natural, organic feel to the live score as it's being tracked, being recorded?
Well, the biggest difference is mic placement and the number of mics. In a typical scoring situation, you would have what's called the decatry. There are 3 microphones that are set about 25 feet back from the orchestra, in addition to all the close microphones. And 90% of the mix would usually come from the decatry because that's the balanced mix that the orchestra themselves are balancing and tuning and mixing themselves, and that's what you're hearing. So in the 12.0 mixes, we'll place many more microphones, including ones that are a much further perspective, maybe back 40 feet, so that we can feel, again, that surround, that visceral feeling that you have in those sound effects that we just witnessed.
Right, yeah, so you get that sort of natural, organic feel
Exactly.
to where we're placing it, and it becomes very, very naturally immersive, which is really important. So then I guess, going to the next step after tracking, then we're mixing now. So I assume that, like you said, most of it's kind of mixed the way off the floor, and then if there are certain extra instruments that need to be added sort of post, the big group, do you, position those when you're doing your final mix, when you're bringing them in, you find a space for them?
I have learned that you can't get too tricky with music, especially. I like to leave those final decisions to the film mixer. I have a deep level of trust with Brian. He's really good, as you can see. And I don't like to force your hand in those kinds of ways. If there's a featured instrument, then we will deliver it on what's called a mixed stem. Many of you are familiar with that term, but that gives Brian control of the placement of that solo instrument. We don't necessarily do anything special for solo instruments when we overdub them. But again, we try to be careful. We utilize the 12.0 mainly for perspective and transparency, if that makes sense. When you can feel a little bit of ambience all around you, that feels natural. And you don't want to hear a loud violin from the ceiling speaker. You want to just hear natural sound. So we're trying to just make sure that everything sounds natural coming from those 12 speakers. Now, I really fought back. You may remember I pushed back. I thought that was a giant pain. I will never, ever complain about it. I just can't believe what I just witnessed today. That was fantastic.
Great. So I think that, one of the discussions that I've had with you and with others is about music delivery. And, sometimes, the best piece of music for the image it comes in the format it comes in. So it could be a stereo track that you want to play against those images, and that really gives it its feel and its texture. And that's fine. We can work with those when we get into our final mixes and stuff. But ultimately, this is an immersive format. So if it's stereo, do you have stereo stems? Right? If it's 5.1, can we get the 5.1 stems and allow us to sort of spread instrumentation out, create a natural feel within the sound space? Tracking in 7.1 if it becomes a little bit difficult to set up the extra mics as Sam was talking about, to create a 12.0 record straight off the floor. Do it in some sort of a multi-channel so we do have access to that natural space and natural reverb that Sam was talking about, to allow us to sort of really make the music as immersive as we can. It's sometimes in like I say, like the song in Apollo 11 that Buzz Aldrin plays, that's an old stereo track, and we put it everywhere, and it does what it's supposed to do in that instance. But
It's actually one of my favorite moments.
exactly right. So it's not. I'm not going to say it's a hard and fast rule. You can't do it, but when you have an opportunity and you're using, orchestral score, whether you're recording it or whether you're grabbing it from somewhere else, let's get a multi-channel version of it, anything from 5.1 to 7.1 and beyond, to give ourselves the best opportunity to use it in the space that we want to. Is there anything more that you'd like to comment on?
I think we should probably just clarify really quickly. When he's talking about stems, what we're talking about is, let's have the brass on a stem, the percussion on a stem, the strings on a stem, solo instruments on a stem. That gives control. Now, composers don't love that, because there's always the possibility that someone who's not a music engineer may remix your music. They may rebalance everything entirely and give you something you didn't intend. So you have to have a level of trust with the film mixer, and I do have that with Brian, so I know he will never abuse that privilege that he has.
I won't.
To take my raw materials and mess with them, because I know that he's serving the interests of the film. I trust that he's doing that. If there's a solo instrument that conflicts with the narration, then he has to pull that down. If there's a low end that clashes with sound effects, then he has to make the decision and choose which is most important to tell the story. So just having that level of trust is really crucial. Composers hate delivering stems, but we do that reluctantly with a gun to our head.
That brings up another question about the communication between the sound designer and the composer, and understanding what we're thinking on different scenes and different sections of the film, to understand who's going to use the low end. Is that going to come from what you were thinking of doing, or is that, can I, put a thunder crack down there? Because it's really easy to be summing all that bottom end in one area, and then, it's creating too much and it's becoming unpleasant. So it's really important. I mean, I think you see the value in sort of, even if it's just getting scratch mixes or thoughts from you to sort of say, this is what I'm thinking of doing, yeah.
I've had some colossal mishaps in this regard. I remember one time on the Hearst Castle film, there was a place where a diver went into the water, and I hit this moment at the precise moment of entrance. Well, the sound effects had a different interpretation of what that moment was, and so we missed. We had to shift that a little bit. Yeah. In another instance, there was a tree that was being felled in the forest, and to me it looked like a little sapling, but to the sound mixer it was a giant redwood, and so he put huge sound effects there, and it obliterated my music. And so, yeah, that communication is really crucial.
Yeah, so it's always important to sort of bring everybody in the sound team together with the filmmaker and sort of talk it through and understand who's going to take what lead in what particular section. So, next slide. We've got one more. So basically, that's everything that we wanted to discuss with you. So is there any questions that anybody wants to ask before we move on to the fun stuff? Okay, well, if you're on your flight home and you went, oh, I should have asked him about this, my contact's up there. You can shoot me an email. Happy to answer any questions post-conference if you're thinking of making a film and you have some specifics or whatnot. But
I want to share one little experience.
Sure, yeah.
I was working years ago with Gary Summers. Some of you worked with Gary. He was at Skywalker Ranch at the time. He's an Oscar-winning sound mixer. And they had pre-mixed for a week with these dialogue and sound effects, and then I delivered the second week the music. And Gary was talking to me, and he said, now, Sam, when you're doing the dialogue, that's like framing the house. And when you're doing the sound effects, that's kind of plumbing the house. And, okay. All right, can you hear me now? I was talking with Gary Summers, and they had been pre-mixing for a week on a particular film, and I arrived the second week with the music after they had done sound effects and dialogue for a week, and he said, Sam, I want you to know that when you're doing the dialogue, that's kind of like framing the house, and when we're doing the sound effects, that's kind of like plumbing the house, and when you're doing the music, that's like sipping a margarita on the beach.
So true. Okay, well, if there's no questions that you want to ask at this time, I'm going to invite my partner in crime, Rick Gordon, up, and he's going to talk more about sound from his perspective. So there's more tips and tricks on how to make your soundtrack sound great. Right, Rick?
That's it.
Okay. Thank you.
I would like to share a sound story that has to do with Sam Cardon that was very interesting, that happened about a year and a half ago, which is when we redid the Hearst Castle film. And one of the mandates, other than to digitizing the film and putting in a laser system in the theater, was that we had to have a new narrative, and we had to have a new music track. So I called Sam, and I said, so Sam, you remember the soundtrack you did for Hearst Castle? And Sam goes, I cannot believe you're calling me today. Yesterday, I got a gig in Hollywood because they had heard that score. And Sam said, it was always one of my favorite scores. And I said, it might be my favorite score you've ever done. So here's the problem. We have to throw it away. Would you accept the challenge of writing a new score for a film you did 20 years ago, and it has to sound different? And he thought for a day and called back, and he did it. And those of you who saw Hearst Castle presented, I think, would agree that it was a terrific score. So it's nice to throw challenges at sound guys. It makes the film